In the Northwood Valley, in the autumn of 1887, a man began to dig his own grave, or so his neighbors believed. His name was Axel Jørgensen, a Danish immigrant with quiet hands and eyes that saw the world in lines and pressures most men missed. While other settlers were racing the coming frost, felling the last of the season's timber, and notching logs for their cabins, Axel was not building up. He was digging down. With a shovel and a wheelbarrow, he carved a massive rectangular pit into the south-facing slope of a low, forgotten hill, the kind of work that seemed more suited to a quarryman than a homesteader. The men of the valley, practical men who measured their worth in stacked cords of wood and the tightness of their cabin's chinking, would stop their wagons on the track below and watch. They saw Axel, his wife Alara, and their young son Lars hauling away load after load of dirt and rock. They saw the hole deepen, becoming a stark wound in the green and gold hillside. They shook their heads and they talked. They talked at the trading post, over fences, and in the pews on Sunday. They said the Dane had finally been broken by the solitude. They said he was building a tomb, a damp, dark cellar that would flood in the spring and fill with a killing cold in the winter. Silas Croft, a man who had built half the cabins in the valley and whose opinion was as solid as the granite foundations he laid, declared it a fool's errand. He had seen men try strange things, but never this. To bury a house was to invite damp, rot, and the crushing weight of the earth itself. It was an act against nature, against common sense, against every piece of hard-won wisdom passed down through generations of survival. What did this quiet Dane, this former shipbuilder from a flat, temperate land, understand about the brutal, soul-crushing winters of the Northwood Valley that they, the men born to its hardships, had missed for a century? To understand Axel Jørgensen's seeming madness, you had to understand the profound misery of a standard Northwood winter. The typical cabin, held up as the pinnacle of frontier ingenuity, was in reality a deeply flawed vessel. It was a box of notched logs, painstakingly fitted, with the gaps stuffed with a mixture of mud, moss, and animal hair. It was a structure at constant war with itself and the elements. From the first hard frost in October, the fight began. The cold did not just knock at the door, it seeped through every wall. The log walls themselves, thick as they were, offered surprisingly little protection. A 12-inch pine log possessed an insulating value, or R value, of roughly 8. This was a paltry defense when the outside air plunged to 20, 30, or even 40 degrees below zero. The cold would migrate directly through the wood, rendering the inside surface of the walls themselves frigid to the touch. Any moisture in the indoor air, from breath or a boiling pot, would instantly condense on these walls and freeze, coating the interior of the home in a shimmering, beautiful, and treacherous layer of frost. The chinking was the cabin's greatest weakness. It dried and cracked in the summer sun, then shrank away from the logs in the autumn damp. This created dozens, sometimes hundreds, of tiny, invisible gaps. When the winter wind blew, and it always blew, these gaps became pressurized nozzles, injecting jets of Arctic air directly into the living space. Families spent countless hours reapplying mud, trying to plug the relentless drafts that snaked across the floor and chilled them to the bone. They hung heavy quilts and animal hides on the walls, a tacit admission that their primary shelter was insufficient. The heart of the cabin, the cast-iron stove, was both savior and tyrant. It demanded a constant, voracious tribute of fuel. A single family might burn through 10 to 15 cords of hardwood in a single winter, an immense expenditure of labor. The felling, splitting, hauling, and stacking of this wood was a year-round job that consumed the lives of men. During a cold snap, the stove had to be fed every hour, day and night. Letting the fire die down for even a few hours meant waking to a house where the water in the bedside pail was frozen solid and breath plumed in the air. The stove created a small bubble of survivable warmth, but it was a small bubble indeed. 10 feet away from its glowing iron sides, the temperature could be 30 degrees colder. The floors, laid over a shallow, uninsulated crawl space, were always frigid, a danger to the feet of children. Axel and Ilara had survived their first Northwood winter in just such a cabin, a rental on the valley floor. Axel, a man trained to think in terms of thermal dynamics and sealed systems, was appalled. He saw not a cozy home, but a wildly inefficient machine for burning wood. He watched the heat from his stove pour out through the walls, the roof, and the countless drafts. He felt the dampness from the ground creep up through the floorboards, making everything feel clammy and cold, even when the stove was roaring. He listened to his son Lars cough through the long nights, a dry, hacking sound that echoed the rasp of the wind outside. He had not come to this new world to watch his family slowly freeze in a box of leaky logs. He knew there had to be a better way. His background was not in carpentry, but in marine engineering. In the shipyards of Copenhagen, he had designed engine rooms for steamships that plied the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The challenge there was twofold: to contain the immense, dangerous heat of the boilers, protecting the ship and its crew, and to keep the frigid ocean from turning the crew's quarters into a meat locker. He had learned that the enemy was not just cold, but heat transfer, conduction, convection, and radiation. He had learned that the best defense was not always a thicker wall, but a smarter one. He learned about the power of insulation, the necessity of a vapor barrier, and the immense, stable energy of thermal mass. During that first winter, while others huddled and endured, Axel observed and measured. He used a precious thermometer to track the temperature differences around his rented cabin: 60 degrees Fahrenheit beside the stove, 35 degrees in the corners, 20 degrees on the floor. He saw the physics of failure laid bare. He also observed the natural world. He noticed how the snow melted faster on the south-facing slopes after a brief winter sun. He dug into a snowbank and found that just a few feet down, the snow was much warmer than the air. And most importantly, he went into an old root cellar, dug into the side of a hill, and noted that while the air outside was 10 below zero, the air inside the dark, earthen space was a stable 45 degrees. The earth itself, he realized, was a massive reservoir of stable, moderate temperature. His neighbors saw the valley as a surface on which to build. Axel saw it as a medium to be used. They fought the cold with fire. He would fight it with mass and insulation. They built porous shells, exposed on all 6 sides to the brutal air. He would build a vessel with only one primary face, exposed to the winter, and he would sheathe the other 5 sides in the greatest insulator he could find: the planet itself. His motivation was simple and fierce. He remembered the feeling of Ilara's hand, cold as stone even when wrapped in wool. He remembered the sight of his son's breath, fogging in their sleeping loft. He was not building a monument to a strange idea. He was building a machine for survival, a fortress to keep his family safe. The construction of what the valley called Jurgensen's Folly was a methodical process, baffling to onlookers. After excavating the huge pit, 40 feet deep into the hill and 25 feet wide, Axel did not start with wood. He started with stone. He and Alara spent weeks hauling wagon loads of gravel from a nearby creek bed. He laid a thick, 6-inch deep bed of this gravel across the entire floor of the excavation. Silas Croft, stopping by one day, scoffed at the effort. A dirt floor was good enough for anyone, he'd said. Axel simply nodded and explained in his careful English. "This is to break the water," he said. "The earth is wet. Water climbs. The stone makes a space. It stops the climb." He was describing a capillary break, a fundamental principle of modern construction, but in 1887, in the Northwood Valley, it was unheard of. On top of the gravel, he and a hired man began to build the walls. Not log walls, but thick, 2-foot-wide walls of native stone, mortared together. These walls rose up directly against the raw earth of the excavation on the back and 2 sides. Before backfilling the small gap, Axel performed another strange ritual. He heated barrels of pine pitch, the same material used to seal the hulls of ships, and painted the entire exterior surface of the stone walls with a thick black, waterproof coating. It was a foul-smelling, laborious task. His neighbors saw it as just another layer of madness. The front of the structure, the south-facing wall, was the most shocking part. Instead of solid logs, it was designed to be mostly open. He framed it with heavy timbers, but the spaces in between were not for logs. They were for glass. He had spent a significant portion of his savings to have large multi-pane window assemblies hauled in by wagon from a city hundreds of miles away. To the thrifty settlers of the valley, this was the ultimate foolishness. Glass was fragile. It was a terrible insulator. It was a luxury reserved for church windows, not the front of a house. It was a flagrant invitation for the cold to pour in. The roof was the final act of this strange play. Axel laid massive timber beams, far heavier than standard rafters, across the stone walls. On top of these, he laid a solid deck of thick wood planks. But he did not stop there. He applied another layer of hot pitch to the entire roof deck, sealing it just as he had the walls. Then he began to put the hill back. He and Alara, using buckets and the wheelbarrow, painstakingly covered the entire roof with a layer of clay, followed by the topsoil he had so carefully set aside months before. When he was done, the roof was buried under 3 feet of earth. He even transplanted the sod he had saved, so that by the time autumn arrived, his house had all but vanished back into the hillside, a green mound with a strange glassy face looking south. Axel's design was a holistic system, with each part serving a crucial function grounded in the laws of physics. The most important principle was thermal mass. The immense weight of the stone walls, the thick stone and gravel floor, and the surrounding earth itself formed a colossal thermal battery. While a log cabin had very little mass and thus could not store heat, Axel's home was designed to absorb and hold energy on a massive scale. The physics were simple. Materials with high density, like stone and earth, require a great deal of energy to change their temperature. Once warmed, they release that heat very, very slowly. This thermal battery was charged by the second key principle, passive solar gain. Axel had noted the sun's low arc in the winter sky. His large south-facing windows were not a weakness. They were the engine of the entire system. Throughout the day, even on partly cloudy days, low-angle sunlight would stream through the glass and strike the dark stone floor and the thick rear masonry wall. This light energy was converted into thermal energy, warming the mass of the house. The glass allowed the shortwave radiation of sunlight to enter, but it was less permeable to the long-wave infrared radiation that the warm floor and walls would later emit, trapping a portion of the heat inside, a rudimentary greenhouse effect. The third principle was super-insulation. The 3 feet of earth covering his roof provided an insulating value, or R value, of over 40. The earth packed against the rear and sidewalls provided even more. Below the frost line, which in that valley was around 4 to 5 feet deep, the ground maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round, typically between 50 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. A traditional cabin had 4 walls, a roof, and a floor all exposed to the brutal, sub-zero ambient air. Axel's cabin was only truly exposed on one face. Its other surfaces were not battling negative 30-degree air. They were interfacing with 50-degree earth. He had effectively raised the baseline temperature his home had to fight against by 80 degrees. Finally, there was moisture and air control. The gravel subfloor and the tarred membrane on the walls and roof created a comprehensive barrier against groundwater and dampness from the surrounding earth, the very problem Silas Croft had predicted would be his downfall. The structure was also exceptionally airtight, with no chinking to crack and no board and batten siding to warp. The uncontrolled air infiltration was near zero. The only drafts would be the ones he designed, a fresh air intake for the stove and a small, operable window for ventilation. To his neighbors, he had built a damp, dark hole. In reality, he had built a dry, bright, thermally stable vessel, applying the logic of a ship's hull to the problem of a home. He had built a machine designed to passively absorb free energy from the sun and store it within a massive battery of stone and earth, all while being protected by an immense blanket of insulation. It was not a cave, it was a fortress. The social conflict began in earnest as the first snows of November dusted the valley. Silas Croft made it a point to visit. He was not a malicious man, but he was a proud one, a keeper of the valley's established truths. He walked around the strange, half-buried structure, his boots crunching in the snow. Axel was outside, splitting a small pile of wood, far smaller than any other man's in the valley. "Jurgensen," Silas began, his tone a mixture of pity and condescension. "The ground will freeze 5 feet down. That frost will heave and crack your stone walls before February." Axel paused, resting his axe. "The walls are insulated from the frost by the earth. The heat from the house will keep the frost away from the foundation." Silas shook his head, a small smile on his face. "You're burying your family alive in a cellar. It'll be damp. The dampness brings the lung sickness. You'll have no light in there, man. It's a cave, not a proper home for a woman and child." "The front is glass," Axel stated simply. "There will be more light than in your cabin, Mr. Croft, and it will be dry. The stone floor prevents the damp." "And that glass," Silas scoffed, gesturing at the expensive windows. "A single pane would be madness, but you have a wall of it. It'll bleed heat faster than you can burn wood. You'll have ice an inch thick on the inside. You have wasted a fortune on a foolish, cold experiment. You'll be begging for firewood by Christmas." Axel looked at the older man, his face unreadable. He did not argue. He did not defend. "Perhaps," was all he said. "We will see come January." Silas left, convinced the Dane was not only a fool but a stubborn one. The story of his visit made the rounds at the trading post, embellished with each telling. The name Jurgensen's Folly was now spoken with a confident derision. Men would laugh as they loaded their sleds with supplies. "Heard the Badger is putting up ice on the inside of his windows already," one would joke. "He's not building a house, he's building a monument to fear," another would pontificate, as if Axel's design were a personal insult to their own brave endurance. The ridicule was constant, a low hum of social pressure that followed Ilara whenever she went to the post for flour or salt. The weight of this judgment fell heavily on her. She trusted Axel's mind, his careful planning, the way he saw the world in numbers and forces, but she was not an engineer. She was a wife and mother, living in a foreign land, and the unified voice of the community was a powerful, corrosive force. One evening, as a bitter wind rattled the panes of their new glass wall, she finally voiced her fear. "Axel," she said, her voice quiet. "Mr. Croft was talking to the blacksmith. He said the weight of the snow will be too much. He said the roof will collapse before the winter is over." Axel was sitting at the table drawing on a piece of paper, calculating something. He looked up at her, his expression softening. He saw the worry etched around her eyes. "The beams are twice as thick as his," he said calmly. "They can hold the weight of the hill. They can hold the snow." "But are you certain this will be warm?" she pressed, her voice trembling slightly. "Lars coughed so much last winter. I cannot bear another season like that. The neighbors, they all say." He stood up and walked to her, taking her hands in his. His were warm. He led her to the rear wall of the house, the massive stone barrier that backed against the hill. He placed her palm flat against it. It was cool but not cold. It felt neutral, solid. "Feel that," he said. "Outside, the air is 10 degrees. The ground here is 50. The wall is holding the heat. The numbers are correct, Ilara. The physics is correct. It will be different this time, I promise." She leaned her head against his shoulder, wanting to believe. But the laughter from the trading post and the confident pronouncements of Silas Croft echoed louder in her mind than the quiet certainty of her husband. In the second week of January, 1888, the weather changed. The wind, which had been a constant scourge, simply stopped. The sky, which had alternated between gray overcast and brilliant blue, turned a hazy, luminous white. The temperature began to fall, not with the sharp drop of a passing front, but with a deep, inexorable settling. The old-timers called it a still cold, a rare and dangerous phenomenon where a massive, stagnant dome of Arctic air settled over the region. They would later call this period the Great Stillness. The mercury in the thermometer outside the trading post fell to 20 below zero, then 25. It hovered there for a day, then resumed its descent. It passed 30, then 35. On the morning of the fourth day, it read, negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit. And there it stayed. For 3 weeks, the temperature never rose above negative 30. The air was so cold and dense, it felt thick to breathe. Every surface was coated in a feathery, crystalline frost. The sound of an axe splitting wood would carry for miles, sharp and brittle in the silent air. For the people of the Northwood Valley, it was a catastrophe. The fight for warmth became a desperate losing battle. The voracious appetite of their stoves became insatiable. Men who had prided themselves on having more than enough wood for the winter now saw their neatly stacked cords vanish at an alarming rate. They were burning through a month's supply in a single week. The intense cold made the log walls and chinking fail spectacularly. The interior frost layer grew thick and furry, covering everything. Water barrels, even those kept just a few feet from the roaring stoves, froze solid. Life ground to a halt. The work of survival became all-consuming. Families abandoned their sleeping lofts and bedchambers, dragging mattresses and bedding into a single cramped space around the stove. They lived in a constant twilight, the windows opaque with ice. The air was choked with smoke, as the dense, heavy atmosphere made it difficult for chimneys to draw properly, causing dangerous backdrafting. Sickness spread. Children were kept bundled in every layer they owned, but it was not enough. In a cabin not half a mile from Axel's Hill, a young boy suffered severe frostbite on his toes while sleeping in his own bed, wrapped in 3 quilts. The cold was not just outside. It was inside, a palpable, malevolent presence. One afternoon, a neighbor named Thomas, his face gaunt with worry and exhaustion, realized he would be out of firewood in 2 days. In desperation, he remembered the Dane. Jurgensen had a small woodpile. Perhaps he would be willing to sell some. Thomas bundled himself against the brutal cold and made the trek to the strange hill. He expected to find a house of horrors, a family on the brink of freezing, suffering even more than his own. He steeled himself for what he might find inside. He knocked on the heavy wooden door set into the glass facade. The door swung open, and Axel Jurgensen stood there. He was wearing a simple woolen shirt and trousers. No heavy coat, no hat. From behind him, a wave of impossible air washed over Thomas, not hot and dry like the air near a stove, but stable, mild, and carrying the faint, pleasant scent of baking bread. Thomas stared, speechless. He looked past Axel into the home. It was bright. The huge windows, free of any ice, allowed the pale, reflected light from the snow to illuminate the entire space. In the center of the room, young Lars was on the floor, on a simple rug, playing with wooden blocks. He was in his shirt sleeves. Near the back wall, Ilara sat in a rocking chair sewing. She wore a simple dress with no shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The cast-iron stove was indeed burning, but it was a low, lazy fire. The damper turned nearly closed. It was ticking over, consuming almost no wood. Thomas felt the profound, impossible warmth, and he could not comprehend it. He looked from the healthy, comfortable family back to Axel, his own face wrapped in a scarf, his beard stiff with frozen breath. He could not form a question. Word of what Thomas had seen spread through the suffering valley like a fever. It was a tale too fantastic to be believed. Warmth, shirt sleeves, a child playing on the floor, no ice on the windows. It had to be an exaggeration, a lie born of desperation. But Thomas was a sober, honest man, and he swore to what he saw. The story reached Silas Croft, who was huddled in his own well-built but failing cabin, burning through his precious woodpile at a terrifying rate. He, more than anyone, knew it was impossible. His own cabin, the best built in the valley, had frost 2 inches thick on the north wall, and the floor was a treacherous sheet of cold. Pride warred with curiosity. If Thomas was lying, he needed to be corrected. If he was telling the truth, then everything Silas Croft knew about building, about survival, was wrong. A man of deep-seated integrity, he knew he could not let it stand. He had to see for himself. The next morning, he took the new, expensive, mercury-filled thermometer down from its hook at the trading post. It was a calibrated instrument, trusted for its accuracy. He wrapped it carefully in a wool cloth and set out for Jurgensen's Folly. When he arrived, the stillness was absolute. The smoke from his own chimney, a mile distant, rose in a perfectly straight, pale column. He paused before the buried house and unwrapped his thermometer. He hung it on the branch of a nearby spruce tree and waited. The mercury column was slow to respond in the intense cold, but after 10 minutes it settled. Silas leaned in close to read the delicate markings. -39 degrees Fahrenheit. A new record. He took a deep breath, the air searing his lungs, and walked to Axel's door. Axel answered the knock. Again, the same impossible sight. A man in a simple shirt. Again, the same impossible sensation. A wave of gentle, stable warmth washing over him. Silas stepped inside, his pride demanding he find the trick, the flaw in the story. He looked immediately at the stove. It was barely idling. He looked at the windows. They were perfectly clear. He saw Ilara and Lars, comfortable and calm. He felt the air on his face. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a pervasive, gentle warmth that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Jurgensen," Silas said, his voice gruff, holding up the instrument. "I came to take a measurement." Axel nodded. "Of course, Mr. Croft." Silas did not want to be fooled by proximity to the stove or the sunlit windows. He walked to the center of the room, equidistant from all heat sources, and placed the thermometer on a small wooden table. Then they waited. The two men, the old master and the new enigma, stood in silence, watching the thin silver line. It rose quickly out of the deep negatives. It passed 0. It passed 10, 20, 30. It slowed as it reached the ambient temperature of the room. It passed 55, then 60. Finally, after 5 minutes, it stopped, unwavering. Silas Croft, the man who had built the Northwood Valley, leaned down and read the number, 62 degrees Fahrenheit. He stood up straight, his mind reeling. He did the math in his head. -39 outside, +62 inside, a difference of 101 degrees. 101 degrees. It was a number that defied all of his experience, all of his knowledge. He looked at Axel, who was watching him with a patient, neutral expression. "The fuel," Silas said, his voice now a hoarse whisper. "Show me your fuel." Axel led him outside. Against the side of the house, under a small lean-to, was Axel's woodpile. It was, as Thomas had reported, shockingly small. Silas could see at a glance that in the 3 weeks of the great stillness, Axel had burned at most a quarter of a cord of wood. Silas himself, in his own house, had burned through nearly 2 full cords. The data was simple, brutal, and undeniable. He had used 8 times the fuel to achieve a fraction of the comfort. He was colder, sicker, and poorer in his perfectly built traditional cabin. He turned back to Axel, the last of his pride falling away, replaced by a flood of pure, unadulterated curiosity. "How?" he asked. It was not a challenge, but a plea. Axel took him back inside. He guided the older man to the rear stone wall and had him place a hand on it. It was not hot, but it was distinctly, subtly warm, radiating a gentle energy. "The sun," Axel explained, "shines on the floor. The floor is stone. The stone gets warm. All day it drinks the heat. All night it breathes the heat back out. It is a battery, a heat battery." He then stomped his foot on the floor. "The ground under us is not 39 below. It is 50 degrees. The house is borrowing warmth from the whole earth." He swept his hand toward the ceiling. "And the roof has 3 feet of dirt and sod. It is a blanket. The heat cannot escape." Silas Croft looked at the warm wall, the bright windows, the healthy child playing on the floor. He looked at the thermometer that read 62 degrees. He thought of his own family, huddled in blankets around a roaring stove in a room that was barely 40 degrees. He thought of the tons of wood he had burned. He thought of his own confident mockery, his public pronouncements of Axel's foolishness. He felt the profound, humbling weight of being completely and utterly wrong. He looked Axel Jurgensen in the eye. "I was wrong," Silas said, his voice clear and steady. "Simply and completely wrong." He paused, the admission hanging in the warm, comfortable air. "You didn't build a cave, Jurgensen. You built a fortress against the cold. This changes everything." The great stillness finally broke at the end of January, but the change it brought to the Northwood Valley was permanent. The story of Silas Croft's visit, of the thermometer reading 101 degrees warmer, and of his public concession became legend. When spring arrived, a season of rebuilding and repair, the work was different. Silas Croft, a man whose integrity proved stronger than his pride, was the first to approach Axel. He did not ask for charity. He offered to pay Axel for his time, to help him draw up plans for a new home for his eldest son. A home to be built not on the flat meadow, but dug into the side of a south-facing ridge. That summer, 2 other families, having lost so much in the deep cold, followed suit. They pooled their labor, with Axel supervising and Silas Croft, the former skeptic, now acting as the project's most vocal and skilled advocate. He explained the principles to the other men, his hands demonstrating the necessity of the gravel bed, the importance of the waterproof membrane. Jurgensen's folly was no longer a term of mockery. It was becoming known as the Northwood Method, or more simply, a Jurgensen house. Within a decade, the architectural landscape of the valley had fundamentally shifted. New homesteaders were told not to build on the flats, but to seek out the south-facing slopes. The old drafty cabins were slowly relegated to use as barns and workshops. The impact on the community's quality of life was profound and multifaceted. The most immediate benefit was economic. Fuel consumption plummeted across the valley. A family in a Jurgensen house might use only 2 or 3 cords of wood a winter, a fifth of what was previously required. This colossal saving of labor freed up hundreds of hours for men to improve their land, tend to their livestock, or engage in other crafts. The constant gnawing anxiety of the woodpile was lifted. The health benefits were even more significant. The new homes were warmer, but more importantly, they were drier and free of smoke and drafts. The persistent winter coughs that had plagued the children of the valley began to disappear. The incidence of pneumonia and other respiratory ailments dropped sharply. The simple human dignity of living in a space that was not actively trying to freeze you created a more resilient, more prosperous community. The Northwood Valley became known not for the brutality of its winters, but for the ingenuity and comfort of its homes. What Axel Jurgensen had created, through careful observation and the application of first principles learned in an entirely different field, was a near-perfect system of passive design. He had no modern terminology for it, but he had mastered its core tenets. His gravel bed was a capillary break and a radon ventilation system. His earth-sheltered walls and roof were a form of super insulation and thermal mass storage. His large south-facing windows were a passive solar collector. His airtight construction was the foundation of all energy-efficient building. These are the very same principles that cutting-edge architects and sustainable builders champion today, often using complex computer models to achieve what Axel Jurgensen figured out with a thermometer, a keen eye, and a memory of keeping a ship's crew warm in the North Atlantic. The story of Jurgensen's folly is more than a tale of a clever design. It is a powerful lesson in the conflict between tradition and innovation, between dogma and evidence. The established wisdom of the valley was not wrong because it was old. It was wrong because it was incomplete. It had stopped observing, stopped questioning. Axel's triumph was not just a victory of engineering, but a victory of humility. The humility to observe the world as it is, to trust in the immutable laws of physics, and to dare to try something different, even in the face of universal ridicule. And perhaps just as importantly, it is a story that celebrates the integrity of the skeptic, Silas Croft, a man strong enough to champion the very idea he once tried to destroy, proving that the greatest wisdom lies not in never being wrong, but in being willing to admit it when you are. The information presented in this narrative is for historical and entertainment purposes only. The construction methods described are based on historical principles and do not reflect modern building codes, safety standards, or engineering practices. Any attempt to construct a dwelling, especially an earth-sheltered one, requires professional architectural and engineering design, adherence to local building codes, and proper soil analysis to ensure structural stability, safety, and moisture management. Do not use this story as a guide for construction.